So good evening, everyone. Just gonna wait another minute until a few more people arrive. It's really good to see you all here. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and hello. And this is our first in a series called Dharma and Justice Dialogues from the Thich Nhat Hanh program for Engaged Buddhism. My name is Peace Twessiji, and I'm the program manager for this program, as well as Buddhism and Interreligious Engagement, all here within Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. So each evening in this dialogue series, the director of the Buddhist program, Reverend Kosin Gregory Snyder, will be in conversation with a different Buddhist teacher or leader or senior practitioner who engages in justice work in one way or another. And this evening's conversation and Dharma and Justice will be with Lama Justin von Bujdoss, who is an American Vajrayana Buddhist teacher who also serves as the executive director of chaplaincy and the staff wellness for the New York City Department of Correction, where he's also a staff chaplain, most notably, including at Rikers Island. So Lama Justin is also an author who has written Modern Tantric Buddhism and Buddhism and Whiteness. You can find links to read more about each of the speakers that I'll put in the chat shortly. So I'm just gonna wait until the siren passes. All right, they're passing now. So just to continue, it's quite a time to be speaking about justice. You know, it's not even a week since the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and today's fresh outrage of many in the response to the Attorney General's decision and lack of accountability for the killing of Breonna Taylor. So this is not even to mention the injustice of the lack of response in the COVID pandemic or the implicit structural anti-Blackness that's pervasive in this country and around the world. But this evening's topic is going to be looking at these questions. How do Buddhists address social and political violence when there can often be an insistence within our traditions that doing so disrupts harmony, it takes sides or creates division? And how do Buddhists ensure our traditions are not do not join in the reproduction of structural oppression and inequity? And also, how can we work diligently for justice without entrenching separation and anger in our minds and hearts? So as you listen to this conversation, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A portion of your screen at the bottom. And at the end of the second part of the hour, we'll get to your questions. So without further ado, welcome, Kosen and Lama Justin. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Peace. And welcome, Lama Justin. It's good to be with you always.
Thank
you know,
you.
when I hear these questions that we put together to respond to, the first thing that comes up is I have no idea how to respond to any of those questions. And one thing I want to say to all of you, welcome, and thank you for coming to this, is the vision for these dialogues certainly isn't that that we have answers to any of these questions, but that we want that there is a raw conversation, because I don't have a list of questions I'm going to put out for Lama Justin. I don't know where the conversation's going to go. We haven't rehearsed anything, so we'll see what happens when we have this conversation, and we'll invite you at a point to engage and put forward your thoughts and questions around this. But one thing I want to say is to the questions that we put forward is we do what I hear from many practicing Buddhists, what I hear from union students who are Buddhists, is there are these rampant issues of injustice in the country. I mean, at this point, if you read the news for more than 3 or 4 days, you can choose from 30 or 40 examples, any one of which should cause deep outrage. And it's almost to the point now where our bodies can't even process the amount of injustice that's in front of us. And so as Buddhist practitioners, if we're in sanghas, that I think there's maybe some shifting here, but certainly my experience over the many years is that sanghas are sometimes reticent to engage issues of injustice. It's felt to be separating. It enters into the sangha in ways that are painful, that can even be perceived as separating the sangha, especially if we were talking about gender injustice and racial injustice. And I'm wondering, I guess, what I would put forward to you, Lama Justin, just to get this going, is when we're talking about karuna, right? When we're talking about what we translate as compassion, that very root in there, kir, itself means action, right? So compassion is active. How do we reconcile this tremendous need for the work of justice, this assertion of karuna as something active, and that there's not always a jumping on board with this, because it feels like it's disrupting a more pure, harmonious expression of Buddhism? What comes up for you in that? What have you experienced? What are your thoughts?
So I think the word that comes to mind is, as you were formulating the question, is capacity. I think, on one level in sanghas, I think, one thing that we find is that the intention, there may be, a dharmic intention around, how and why we gather to practice. and study Dharma and practice Dharma, etc. There are these really kind of basic questions around the degree to which sanghas have the capacity to actually hold a wide and safe amount of space to be able to really go into these questions in detail. And I think that this is a problem in a lot of our sanghas, you know, especially in the West, where we have this kind of like nexus, an intersection of what we call the tradition and modern issues, including justice issues, environmental issues. And the question is, how can we do this skillfully? As well as how does our own idea of capacity with respect to how we approach the tradition, how we envision what this work should be, need to be addressed and need to be expanded and need to be maybe even in some cases reinforced. You know, when you mention the difficulties that sanghas can have discussing race or gender inequality or ableism or, you know, in patriarchy, the question is, you know, does the sangha, the particular sangha, have the capacity to be able to have the conversation in a way where people don't become reactive and spin off into the creation of even greater harm? Or what we see, you know, I think commonly in our culture these days, you know, just across the board, is this digging in of heels in particular positions, unable to necessarily get into the really painful and difficult space of directly engaging that which either we don't agree with or which, you know, we see as unjust, or scary in a way that allows there to be a promotion of larger harmony, like the larger harmony being cutting into these really difficult and painful things with a view towards healing, creating balance, liberation, you know, and not in the like, you know, oh, liberation, I have no problems kind of way, liberation into a magnitude of increasing complexity, which is inherent when we have groups come together, and to recognize the places that they occupy in relationship to power and the impact that that has, and a real ownership and acknowledgement of these positions.
So there are a few things there. I want to jump in. I mean, one thing that strikes me is this word liberation, because I feel like we're dealing with one of the things that's coming together when we start talking about sanghas working in justice, around justice issues, is two notions of what liberation means. You know, in one case, we have this Buddhist idea of liberation, or this Buddhist practice of liberation that the Buddha laid out for us, that talks about the grasping mind and clarifying the grasping mind. You know, in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in short, the self-grasping aggregates of the mind are suffering, right? We're clear that that's what we're looking at, and that's what we're taking on. There's this other form of liberation that is a historical material notion of liberation, right? We have people who have centuries of being treated as less than human, as being treated as free labor, as being, you know, on and on and on. We can lay all of that out, and the notion of liberation has to do with changing the material circumstances of this situation, of looking at the reproduction of violence within our institutions, within our systems, you work in the prison system. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And these two do not seem to come together very often, right? And in the Buddhist world, sometimes it's almost as if there's almost a kind of allergy at times to even the suggestion that one should view liberation in the change of material circumstances. It's right, no, if I'm not grasping the mind, whatever the situation is that's going on should be okay, right? I should be able to be liberated within my circumstances, whatever they are. This to me seems to be a little bit of nonsense. And so, but when this kind of work does come together, my experience is that it's considered a politicizing of Buddhism. It's not considered often another expression of, in our cases, people within Mahayana traditions, the Bodhisattva vow to liberate all beings. It's not, that material change is not included in that a lot of times historically. And so I think what's so critical at this moment is, you mentioned the difficulty having the conversations. There's this first step of the difficulty of having the conversations. There's also then this, how do we engage when we're having those conversations? How do we actually look at, because I find, when I'm talking to educated white folks in the United States and Sanghas, we're able to kind of have conversations with each other a little bit. But the minute it actually approaches two things, one is folks taking real responsibility for their part in the recreation of oppression and violence. That's one where it starts to get edgy. The other one is, and this is where it really gets difficult, is, and let's make structural change to the way that our sanghas are organized and how we support people that are that don't have the same level of privilege. Here we are, two educated white men who are sitting in ordained positions of power within a tradition that has struggled with the very same thing all the way back. So when we get into the hairiness of all of that, what then? How does a sangha turn toward I don't even want to say how, because I don't expect you to answer this, but what are the things that come up when we think about a sangha turning toward having those conversations that can be gut-wrenching? Because suddenly I have to recognize that I'm not just a karmic pivot for my own suffering. I'm a karmic pivot for society's suffering. And I have to take, so I'm just going to throw that out there, see what you think.
So, I think I'm thinking about what it means to take responsibility first for location. And I don't think that this is something, I was going to say, I don't think this is something that happens, for a lot of Dharma practitioners, but that's not entirely true, because I have met people who have done a tremendous amount of work on that prior to coming to Dharma. But I think that it's this discomfort and this, this fear of acknowledging things like the impact of capitalism, the impact of living in a materialist society, the ease with which we can use Dharma to disengage, and perhaps not even recognize that. To not recognize the importance of something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's easy for me as a white male who, is privileged in this culture to be able to engage in, what would be considered a leisure, activity of spiritual practice, and then, occupying a place of professional spiritual leadership. Excuse me. And that's something that I need to own. There's to not recognize that, and to not recognize the impact that has in relationship becomes problematic. And I think that it doesn't matter if you're the head of a Dharma group or practitioner or somebody coming in just to check a place out. There needs to be an understanding that that kind of self-reflection and critical analysis is part of Dharma practice. Being able to understand in the Vajrayana traditions, we talk about patterned mind, mind that's just habituated to basically see things in a particular way. That whiteness, for example, is a form of patterning. Patriarchy is a form of patterning. Ableism is a form of patterning. And so I think the kind of initial knee-jerk reaction around the discomfort of looking at these things is understandable, the same way fear is understandable. It's uncomfortable. This makes us scared. There is no sutra on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So addressing that in a Dharma setting and talking about what it means to be under-resourced or what it means to be overprivileged within our culture or a Dharma organization is something that I think, again, going back to this word capacity, that a lot of Dharma practitioners don't have a lot of capacity for at some point, but this is something that we can develop, which is also a testament to the importance of how this has to be yoked and seen as a form of Dharma practice.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no, and when I'm hearing that, I mean, I struggle in my own tradition because in Soto Zen there's such a focus on sitting meditation, and you spend a lot of hours in a day sitting, and it's hard to reconcile that with this because there's an elitist aspect to it. We get to sit around and maybe some donors support you in doing it, but who are the people donors give money to, and who are the people donors don't give money to? That's racialized, that's gendered. And so there's just understanding how the tradition itself as a practice adapts to this and create space, doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it recognizes the necessity of the building of concentration and stability of mind. And yet our bodies need to get out there. Our voices need to get out there. We can't be sitting around all of the time. And that balance, I certainly have not come to a clarity around how you structure a training day so that all of those things are included,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll stop there. That's what came up in hearing what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that, and I tend to agree. And then at the same time, I feel like one of the benefits of chaplaincy is that it takes you out of that
Mm-hmm.
and into these places of increased activity. And then increased discomfort, hopefully, as well. So if it's in hospital settings, then dealing with people who are sick, dying, going through crisis, or completely shut down, perhaps in relationship to their situation in the moment. In my particular case, with correctional chaplaincy, it's really facing violence, facing human suffering, whether they're people in custody or staff, kind of all stuck in the system. And then my own reactivity to all of these things, right? And the beautiful thing is, and I guess the argument for throwing the purity of Dharma into a muddy puddle is that we have direct experience of mind all the time.
Yeah.
So whether or not it's, we're in a crowd in a protest situation, coming to direct reflection on our physiological response to all of the energy that's arising, either within ourselves or within the immediate environment, and understanding that and learning how to develop capacity in relationship to that is profound. What to do when, I'll give you an example. Last week I was, I work for the city, and so we're constantly kind of in COVID preparation mode. And I found some models on, I think it was Gothamist, and they may have been Department of Health models, but showing the distribution of COVID positivity rates in the city, and they're all in primarily black and brown, neighborhoods or parts of the city, with a discrepancy sometimes, in some cases, positivity rates of up to 12 and bordering on 14%. Whereas, in lower Manhattan, it's, easily under 1.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just disturbing. I mean, it's disturbing it's disturbing that it's not broadcast everywhere. And so that enters into my practice in the sense of how to actually hold that split,
Mm-hmm.
how to hold that inequality, and then how to be present for a city that is structured that way. It's hard, it's painful, it hurts, it's enraging. And again, the more we put Dharma glasses on, where everything looks, Om Shanti, the less we see, the less present we are. And we're really just kind of, operating from a position of our own projections and habits and, lack of clarity.
Yeah, this lack of clarity and a kind of, what strikes me, to go back to what Peace brought up in the introduction around Breonna Taylor, around the constant witnessing of the murder of Black folks, and not, this is one piece of a legal and so-called justice system that, from the moment somebody enters the public school system all the way into the prison system and potentially being killed in the streets, it's rigged. It's set to one side, and we know this. There are people who actively argue against it, but we know it. And when and especially for people who consider themselves progressives, when you're sitting here and you have an awareness of the prison system, and I'll bring it up because you're in that, you're in that every day. You have an awareness of the prison system. You have an interest, you have an awareness that we are caging people all over the country. You have an awareness that that we are doing that based on racialized and classed measures that are wildly skewed. And in many cases, people are being thrown in prison, especially in jails like Rikers, oftentimes without trial, and they're there for quite some time. So this is where we're living, and it is stunning to me that somebody can go through a process of awakening and for them not to become increasingly aware and feel what's going on, and then not want to. If you're going to feel that, first of all, there's a few things that need to happen. You need to be using Dharma practice to kind of tune out, to not feel that, to not make those connections. If you're not doing that and you're beginning to feel it, then we're making choices not to act in ways that are wholesome and moral. Disturbing. And also, one thing you and I have talked about before, when you let yourself feel that, you're not actually all that calm. I don't feel particularly calm. I know how to work with my conditioning. I know how to work with what's going on in my body when I feel certain emotions, but it is impossible for me to actually feel what's happening and not sometimes be enraged, sometimes be hopeless, sometimes feel what the hell is wrong with us as a species, and all of these things. And that needs to be, at least for my practice, that needs to be a part of this. Otherwise, it all feels like nonsense. You know, the dharmic world just feels like nonsense if that's in the middle of it. So I think there's something here about you know, I'll end with this. I'm reminded of something James Cone wrote about in his first book on Black theology of liberation, where he talks about what he calls conversion, where you begin to, where if you're in a privileged space, he didn't use that word, but if you're white in this case, and you begin to join the community of struggle of Black folks, and there is a conversion process where you slowly drop whiteness as the place where you ground yourself. He says really something that has always stuck with me. He wrote, he said, if you truly join the struggle of the oppressed, you will begin to take on the pain of that struggle. You will begin to feel the pain of that situation. So what I loved about that is like, the body tells you if you're there, if you're involved, you know, and the heartbreak and the tears to the body that emerge when you recognize the viciousness of what our society is doing to people, is you don't just meditate that out.
No, you don't. No, you know, and I mean, even a phrase like "tame your mind,"
Yeah.
you know, like that. If you were to really tame your mind, you know, I agree 100% that it necessitates a level of empathy and compassion and understanding one's own place within all of this and the suffering itself. And I will tell you, on a weekly basis, I find myself anxious for most of each day. You know, I feel it, you know, in my belly. I feel it. I feel fear. I feel just tremendous amounts of human suffering. And so, you know, to some extent, why I stay doing this work is to remain, you know, rooted in the ground, right? Rooted to, this is our situation, right? And so, like, this is our situation in many different ways as humans. And in our culture in particular, this is like, you know, like if you can't have your eyes open to this, then your eyes are not open. And I think that there is a lot of work that Buddhists in the United States, because that's all I can really speak to in terms of you know, experience, need to do to get out of the head and into the heart, and maybe even out of the heart into the belly, you know, where so much emotion arises. And I agree with you that it is debatable. I do not think, like, for example, the teachers I have had in Asia who are, you know, I would say are awakened, become distraught when they understand that a neighbor may be slaughtering a chicken and will try and go and stop it. But for us, our idea of enlightenment, you know, is this kind of, you know, fool on the hill kind of, you know, proposition, which, you know, and again, the kind of capitalist kind of patterning that we are conditioned to also, in a kind of reinforces this idea that enlightenment means that we are on high, separated from all of the hustle and bustle, and have, you know, lovely living situation and all this other stuff. my interpretation of awakening is a situation that is much more in the vernacular and in the everyday. You know,
Mhm.
like a Bruegel kind of like, you know, experience with just everyday people.
Mhm.
And that does necessitate an ability and a desire to want to be open to not only the suffering of others, but then, of course, our own relationship to the suffering of others, and then our own experience of how we suffer in the moment truly.
Mhm.
Because again, you know, if you walk into a beautiful Dharma center where everything's nice and nobody wants to talk about anything uncomfortable, yeah, it feels nice. It's like, you know, a great place to spend an afternoon
Yeah.
as a vacation. But when we really look at, you know, not only how it is that I am constantly unhappy, constantly putting my faith and my hopes into systems that create not only my own suffering but the suffering of so many other people. You know, when until we have our eyes open to that, I don't know how much practice we're actually really doing.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I think that's a good, you know, to start with with what you said at the beginning of this last set of comments. You know, when it comes to this level of injustice and violence, if your eyes are not open to this, your eyes are not open. I think that that is, I think that that's true. I can't imagine taking any awakening seriously that was not engaged heart and gut. And I agree that distinction is really important, you know, heart and gut in the middle of this, in the middle of this. And people will come to that in different ways, but to pretend it's somehow outside of awakening and liberation in some way.
Mm-hmm.
This is, I don't know what world somebody's living in, if that's true. I don't know what the world is for that person. It's a
Yeah,
very small world, you know. So
a distorted world.
yeah, it's a distorted world.
And I mean, you know, it kind of raises this question. And actually, you know, before I took my position with the OC and accepted the job offer, my big fear was this idea of collusion within a system that propagates, or you know, I mean, you know, it can be a little dramatic, that disfigures everybody who enters into it.
Mm-hmm.
And so both, you know, uniform staff, non-uniform staff, you know, and then people in custody who end up, you know, in our system, everybody is disfigured, you know. And as far as collusion goes, waking up in the morning or at some point during the day, checking in to make sure that I am holding this space responsibly. You know, that I am not just going to be, you know, like a civil servant working in a hell realm who punches in and out and just hopes to get a pension. You
Mm-hmm.
know, that actually like may the needle get moved. May I be able to make this place better. May I work to create change. And I don't want to be in the position if I can't be moving in that direction. You know, there becomes this element of responsibility, which I think that you know when we talk about the Bodhisattva model, which you find in Mahayana tradition, Vajrayana tradition, etc., we need to be able to own our impact. And you know, let's face it, ignorance of impact, you know, is still on us.
Yeah, right.
You know, it's
Before we turn over, it's about time to turn over to questions. But you know, this what you say your intention is within, you know, in your role at Riker and within the prison system. Um, I feel it resonates very strongly with what I feel our role should be as caretakers of the Dharma. You know, that if we're not, you know, we're responsible for how this is replicated, how it's passed forward, and do I fill my role in a way that is responsible to the reality that is in front of me and includes as many people as it can include. And if you start including all the people, there are a whole lot of people who are unjustly suffering within the system for many reasons. So how do we hold these positions as caretakers of the Dharma in a way that includes them so that the Dharma is responding to them?
Absolutely.
You know?
And I mean, just real quick, I mean, how can we make a home in the fear of the fact that we are quote unquote changing the tradition, or you know, quote unquote, watering it down or making it impure? You know, I think that this is another place, you know, this is important work for this generation, the next generation, if Dharma is really going to take hold in the West in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
You know.
That's good. Let's turn. I think peace is going to help support question and response.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both so much. Yeah, this is a rich conversation, which could, I'm sure, continue for weeks and weeks. I'm just going to jump into these questions and feel free to answer as you feel moved. So I'm going to abbreviate some of them. And this first person, Upayati, has written that sometimes there are folks in their community that talk about, you know, Black Lives Matter being a Marxist, antithetical, you know, topic to bring up in a Dharma setting. So do you have any guidance on ways to stay in this conversation? Because they often say this is not what should be happening in this space. It's political, etc. Should they stay in this conversation without it being derailed, or should they, like, do you have any guidance? It's pretty difficult.
I could jump at this. Do you want to say something about this, Justin? Or
I mean, I'll just say, if we were able to wear our thoughts, you know, on our face, then, and our feelings, whether or not something's Marxist or not is not the issue. I mean, we're bringing all of our ugliness, you know, and all of our base qualities into Dharma centers, into every moment. I personally take the tack that nothing is off limits. You know, everything should be able to be addressed and treated and spoken about.
Yeah. I mean, my feeling about this conversation, because I hear the same thing. There are we have basically politicized compassion so that it's now bad.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so we have catchwords. It's Marxist, or it's this, or it's that, or whatever it is. And Marxist is the big one. And or it's bleeding heart, or it's impractical. I don't really care what it is. But the point is that if the impulse underneath is something rooted in compassion, because we are responding to suffering, that is the thing that I would bring forward. If somebody says, I mean, in the case of Black Lives Matter, it is pointing to a real violence and a real suffering. However it structures itself, and I am quite confident there are Marxists within BLM and there are not Marxists in BLM, and there are all kinds of people that are involved in that movement, and to simply write it off because it's connected to an ideology. This is an interesting thing to point out, but if there was a way to offer the question of what is going on for somebody that they need to reduce a movement that is pointing to suffering to an ideology that allows them to dismiss it.
Mm-hmm.
And that process, that leap that people go through, that is, we just need to take that, we need to discern and take that apart a little bit, because there's a huge language in the United States that basically convinces us that devoting our lives to the alleviation of material suffering is somehow politically wrong. And that just needs to stop. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm now reading a question that's asking on advice for someone who works in a situation where the racism that is causing that where there's racism that's causing suffering. So they agree with you and they have to see how harm happens when it's the oppressor that can't feel the pain of the oppressed. But do you have any advice on the oppressed in that situation?
What this is a clarification question. What do you mean advice?
I can't say more. Do you have more to say about the person being oppressed in the situation? I think the conversation has been about
Yes.
having power and privilege, but do you have any advice or recommendation for someone who is being oppressed in a structural way, more personal?
I don't know that I would say I have advice. That wisdom isn't going to come from me, but I would say that communities. I mean, if we're talking about, if we're talking about Dharmic communities, I can say that the things that I've seen, and this is no news, the things that I've seen are empowering, is when communities that have experienced historical oppression self-organize into their own self-empowered communities, and therefore cultivate a narrative around the Dharma that is their own, and that the wisdom comes from that space, and there is a strength to engage the kind of privilege narrative on from a position of strength. I think that is that's what has to happen, both in the small dharmic setting and in the large setting too. Easier said than done, but I don't. And somebody said, if I don't have it, why not? Because I don't think that. I think it would be somewhat presumptuous to say that I have advice for that particular question. It's not. We're not talking about a Dharma question here, as much as we're talking about a question of, at least the way I hear the question, of what it is to organize around the wisdom of those who have experienced oppression. It's not, especially if we're talking about racial or gender oppression, it's not the same experience. I can talk about other kinds of violence that I've experienced, but not those. So, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It would be strange for me as a white male who, occupies the place that I do, to say that I know, what those who are oppressed or more oppressed than I, or in down power positions will need. The one thing I do, and I agree that it becomes vital to look at the structure of Dharma centers or Dharma organizations, and to look at correcting for systemic oppression in the structure itself, and that means bearing witness. It means holding space for others. It means providing the resources for people who have been oppressed to be able to define what it is that they need, and for that not to come from someone like me or someone in the up power position. A much more compassionate model needs to be held.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to touch into two questions and bring them together. One is asking about white privilege and how to stand, for lack of a better word, in the heart and gut and suffering, stand along with others, solidarity. And there was also a question about talking about how Dharma communities are quite good at analyzing structures of oppression, but not so good about dismantling them. So do you have any advice on ways of, or like what is being missed, or how can this be moved forward?
Yeah, so I mean, I could speak to the latter a little bit. I've been involved in Sangha formation with Lama Rod Owens for the Sangha called Bumi Sparsha. And we've spent a lot of time trying to look at how to structure things in a much different way. Very organic, a little bit messy, kind of experimental. And, I think that it, I don't think that we end up looking at this from the standpoint of, what the final goal should be, but it's this work in progress to see, okay, how can we make this more equitable as we move forward? And there's constant conversation. There's a considerable amount of community check-in and response, and there is conflict. I mean, in order to be able to address power, you need to be able to hold space for difficult conversations and conversations that can be painful. And I think that this also kind of ties into the first part of the question about, being somebody who is in an up power position or privileged position. One of the best things you can do is recognize when you're taking up too much space and to allow others to be able to come into the conversation and to look at what can be done to create and understand what safe space is. And I think, this idea of safe space is another one of these things that gets vilified, all over, with the belief that maybe it waters down conversation, or it's risk averse or conflict averse, and it's actually not. It's rooted in being able to allow people to walk into any given moment as themselves in a way that's authentic, and understanding one's own power and privilege and position in relationship to power and privilege becomes a really important piece in addressing how we unconsciously exert power over others. I don't know if that's clear or mucked up.
Yeah. Go ahead, Peace.
Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, just looking at it, I'm going to group two more questions together. One is about, they're both about justice. So the question, is there a concept of justice that's within the Buddhist framework? And should we be looking to other traditions to help us develop a sense of justice? Because there's a lot of emphasis on the non-material liberation in Buddhist texts. So how can we, just bring this thought process together?
So thank you. There's just an interesting thing about the word justice. So the word justice is the root in Latin jus is related to is a Indo-European cognate with you, which is the root for yoga, and dike, which is the root for justice in Greek, is a cognate of dir, which is the root for dharma. So this idea of dharma and yoga, where we tie ourselves to a path that takes us toward liberation, these have connections to the Greek and Latin notions or Roman notions of justice. But I want to say something about that. So if you're going to look for justice, the way dharma is usually the one. Dharma is usually the one that would be the closest word to something like justice. Now, why does that matter? I think what's not in place, there is a notion of dharma in the sense of being in harmony with the movement of the cosmos or the universe or dependent co-arising, which this was the way justice was understood before social justice came on the scene as a frame. What I think is not, you don't find historically in Buddhism, is this sense of responding to structural and systemic injustice in a way where there is a group of people who are the recipients of the structural violence and those who have the power over them. That just simply isn't a major question around justice in Buddhism. So I think you see it coming about in the turn of the 1890s, in moving into the 20th century. And a lot of this is because Buddhism starts responding to colonization. And so there's something very similar for Buddhists in their experience at that point that that would bring about a different sense of justice. So do we need to look to other traditions? Yeah, we are. I mean, we're always looking to other traditions. We're always in conversation with other traditions. I think the Western notion of social justice is something that is in the form that we understand it now is actually relatively recent, but we're now taking it on as Buddhists, and I don't think there's any way that Buddhism is going to mature in the West without incorporating it. So we have some sense of what it is, and now the work to be done is how do we understand social justice within the framework of the Dharma, rather than just kind of patching it on from another tradition. There's work to do to understand it within our own cosmology, our own way of being in the world, our own understanding of reality. Social justice is going to start making its way into that. We're going to be able to understand it for ourselves within our own tradition. Traditions change. Emptiness wasn't always up front. The Bodhisattva vow was not always something that was an aspect of schools of Buddhism. Now justice is going to be something that is an idea. This kind of justice, social justice, will be a part of Buddhism. And in 500 years, it will be a native Buddhist concept, even though right now it's not. So a little bit of a long answer.
All right, if I could ask just one more for the evening. Okay, so I'm gonna sum it up a bit, but so Lama Justin, you spoke of, feeling more in the heart and belly. And we've also talked about privilege and positionality. And how do you, maybe both of you as teachers, teach your practitioners, the white practitioners particularly, to become sensitive in these ways, particularly thinking about white fragility and in the ways that we're asking sometimes folks to feel into an oppressed position, because often this is missing. Often the white fragility is centered in a moment of crisis. So how do you hold students accountable for practicing the sensitivity to feel along with?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, for me, it has to be addressed, and it can't not be included within Dharma training. This critical understanding of location in our culture, especially for white students, and especially white male students. I won't work with people if they can't take that on. I feel at the end of the day, you can experience a form of realization without addressing these things, but it's a very, it's not the cessation of suffering. We, and I, as a white male Dharma teacher and a practitioner who's still on the path, find that there is immense personal spiritual benefit in being able to understand the imprint of my location in relationship to all of these things, because my imprint has impact, and that impact affects others. And so if within the context of Dharma, if we're going to be looking at how to take responsibility for the ways that we collaborate in the suffering of other beings, we have to bring this onto the path. And I think that I agree with Greg's last point that this will become an indigenous Western Dharma practice. And I feel that it is increasingly becoming that way. It can't not be done. That's where I stand on this. It's essential.
So it looks like we're coming to an end. There's so much more to say about all of this, and I'm sorry. And I see. I'll just say that I see that I misunderstood someone's point here. So if we had time to respond to that, I would be happy to. But unfortunately, we don't. We have to close out at 8. But I hope that you all come back to these conversations going forward, and please bring these questions back again. You can also, I'm happy for you to email me. You can reach me. My email for Union is online. I'm happy for you to send me any of these questions, and I can talk to you about them. But I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. And I appreciate all of you being here. I think the next conversation is with Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. I don't know the exact date off the top of my head, but I'm sure it will be put on it's probably already on the Union website. And I hope to see all of you back, and thank you for being so engaged and bringing such good questions and thoughts to all of this. And thank you, Lama Justin, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Greg.
Really good to see you. And thanks, Peace, for facilitating.
Yeah, thank you, Peace.
Yeah. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.